starting. Okay, so again, we're talking about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, today, and we're going to get into what they are, and then, of course, what it means for us as members of the clean beauty industry. So as Gay said, I'm Aubri Thompson. I'm a clean beauty chemist. I started my career at the Honest Company in Rodan and Fields, and now I serve several consulting clients. And I have done both my degrees at Berkeley, and I'm in the Bay Area, living in Oakland right now. So on the agenda is to go over kind of the definition of GMOs, get into why they're controversial, and then talk about some new ingredient technologies, specifically genetically modified microorganisms, and then how that all ties in to us as we're formulating and setting our standards for products. So some of the context is that we humans have been trying to alter the DNA of plants and animals for centuries, and we've typically done this through selective breeding. So one example of this is the Brassica family, which you can see in the photo. Cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale. These all came from the same original plant, mustard seed, and that was bred for different traits, and that's how we ended up with this huge array of vegetables in that family. So GMOs, on the other hand, these contain DNA that has been altered using genetic engineering, rather than some of these other breeding techniques that humans have used in the past. So one thing to note is that this could include inserting DNA from one organism into another. And so the prototypical example of GMOs is taking a cat, inserting a gene from a glow-in-the-dark jellyfish to create a glow-in-the-dark cat. And that is a very extreme example and hasn't actually been done, but that's kind of how we think about how that works. So currently, these are on our shelves in our supermarkets, and many of us aren't aware of that already, which I think is a huge problem, but these are some of the ones that currently already exist. There is papaya that's resistant to the ring spot virus, and actually, without this breed of papaya, we may not even have papaya anymore. It's really only grown in Hawaii, and this threatened pretty much the entire population there. Then we have corn that's resistant to insects. So it has a gene from a certain bacteria that allows like insects to be repelled but not affect humans. And so you don't have to spray insecticide on that corn anymore. Apples that don't brown, so they're on the shelf for longer. And then salmons that mature more quickly, so they have higher levels of growth hormone. And this is just kind of a sampling. It's kind of funny to see like where the line is drawn personally. Like for me, the salmon that matures too quickly is just like a little weird and it doesn't really sit well, but then I'm glad there's still papaya around. So there's a lot of mixed feelings here, and that's okay. And we'll kind of get into some of where the lines are drawn. But again, it is still a controversial topic. So feel free to feel all the feelings. This next slide is where I personally think it's become completely unacceptable. And this is with Roundup ready crops. So now instead of engineering plants that are resistant to pests, such as the corn that was resistant to insects, this is now creating crops that are resistant to pesticides. So now we can just use however much pesticide we want and the crop will be okay, but we won't have any of the pests. So this is really famous with Roundup, which is glyphosate. It's an herbicide that has been shown to cause cancer. And we now have GMO soy, canola, corn, sugar beets, and wheat in the US that is Roundup ready, so it's resistant to the herbicide Roundup, and this has actually increased the use of Roundup and therefore increased its prevalence in the environment. So this is just, you know, too far for me. But we do have to kind of weigh the good and the bad here. There's definitely some of each. Some of the good things would be increasing yield and pest resistance, which could end up being lower land use. There's also the option to enrich certain crops. For example, rice is one of the staples in many developing countries, but it doesn't have many nutrients. So there's a new crop of rice that's GMO called golden rice, where they actually have beta carotene in the rice. And that allows this rice to provide nutrients and prevent loss of eyesight in some of these developing countries. Longer shelf life means less food waste. And then we could potentially modify to create drought resistance or other climate change adaptability characteristics. And as we're seeing with the fires in California and otherwise, this could end up being really important. But then we have the bad. We have possible impact on the natural environment. What happens if these organisms get out into nature and interact with the species that haven't been modified? What does that look like? There's possible exposure to allergens. If you're allergic to soy and you're picking up, a piece of fruit and you didn't know that it had been modified to put a soy gene in there, you could potentially have an allergic reaction. Also, we have this Roundup Ready thing, which results in an increased use of pesticides, and it's just an example of kind of corporate greed. And then along with that, you have the corporate control of the technology. They own these seeds and these GMOs. So you're kind of paying them every season that you're planting these. And then there's the moral dilemma of playing God. So we have a tendency to want to do that, as with the selective breeding, but does this, cross a certain line? As far as regulations go, these GMOs are not well regulated in the US. Technically, they're regulated by the FDA, EPA, and USDA, and each agency has a portion that they concern themselves with. But really, it's not required to get pre-approval before selling a GMO product, and you can kind of slip under the radar. Starting in 2022, they are requiring a bioengineered label. So up until now, they haven't even had to label that it is a GMO. Now they will. This is their term that they want to use, bioengineered, so that consumers can have a little bit more of a say in what they're going to buy, but there's still not a process for approval. And just to note, bioengineered / GMO ingredients are excluded from the organic label. So if you have something that's organic, it is automatically non-GMO. Organic is kind of the highest standard you can have. You can have non-GMO under that. But a non-GMO label could still include the use of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. Okay, now on to kind of a fun and newer topic, which is ingredients produced by genetically modified microbes. We have a lot of food and beverage products currently that are produced by microbes, for example, wine and beer. So these are yeast that feed on the sugars in grapes or barley and produce alcohol. So in that way, there are different yeast strains that produce different compounds. So what if we modified those yeast to change the compounds that they produce or increase the levels of what they can produce? And that has already started being done. So for example, the vegan heme used in Beyond Burgers is actually created by a genetically modified yeast. This yeast has a gene inserted into it from soy that allows it to produce heme. So it's fed sugar and it produces this heme molecule. So if you've had a Beyond Burger, I wonder if you knew that. I'm kind of tuned into this topic, but it is kind of unknown to consumers that there is something that was produced by a GMO within this product. And in a way, it is really a good thing, because the alternative would be to grow all of this soy and then remove the nodules and extract the heme. So you'd be taking maybe 1% of the whole product and wasting the rest. So we're saving land, we're not creating as much waste, but is it really right that consumers wouldn't have that information? It's a little weird. And then in beauty, we've seen this sugar-derived squalane. This is actually produced by a genetically modified yeast that produces squalane. And so in a way it's sugar derived because we're feeding sugar to the yeast and they're then producing the squalane. But again, that's kind of shady. It's kind of hiding what's really going on. Not that what's going on is a bad thing, but it kind of is against I feel it goes a little bit against the transparency that we've committed to, especially for clean beauty. As far as regulations on these types of organisms, there is none in the US, and that's why the Beyond company doesn't have to share at all that they're using this, because the compound itself is not genetically modified. It was produced by a GMO, but the molecule itself is not alive, it doesn't have DNA, so it is not a GMO. In the EU, they have better regulations on this. All must be pre-approved, and you have to show safety data and also a containment plan, so how you're going to keep these microbes contained and not released out into the environment where they may interact with, you know, the natural microbes that are already occurring there. So kind of the conclusion here, it's hard to make broad sweeping claims about GMOs. There's so much that falls under that category, the GMMs, and then there's the use for good and the use for evil, and it's a lot to sift through. But for me, the most important thing is transparency and allowing consumers to educate themselves and make those decisions for themselves. So what that means is pushing for clearer regulations and clearer labeling, and that even goes back to when we're talking to ingredient suppliers or setting our ingredient standards and thinking about how we're gonna demand transparency there. So the questions that I'm gonna kind of leave you with as a brand is, what is your stance on GMOs? Many of us here are probably, like, our gut reaction is like, we're against them because we obviously want to favor organic products. But what does that mean about GMMs and compounds that come from there? Even if that is the more sustainable option, are we okay with that? And then from there, how are we going to communicate this to consumers without overwhelming them, but also without oversimplifying and kind of making decisions for them along the way? So it's tough, but we all, you know, have our standards already around what natural means, what preservatives we're going to use, that type of thing. I think it's worth adding a line item or just having a conversation about this topic with the rest of your team. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions through the chat or live, and you can also email me or email Gay, and we can follow up a little bit more. Gay, did you want to add anything?
No, I just thought it was really interesting to read through the European regulations and see that, you know, they've clearly had extensive conversations. It's pretty clear. It's very similar to the organic regulation, actually. You have to demonstrate your practices and your process, and that's what the organic law is about. So, and I think it might be interesting to give a couple of examples. The heme, because that's the blood appearance, right? The red in that Beyond Burger. And I think almost all of those veggie burgers that are more meat-like, because there's another brand, right? Is also from a genetically modified molecules. And I think if you start asking around, you know, for example, butylene glycol, there is a sugar-derived butylene glycol that is on the market. We saw a presentation at the conference we had for NOHBA by one of the producers of that product. They're making it in Italy, and they're very forthright about it. They talk about using this technology. It's very clearly biotechnology. Another one, though, is the propandiol. Propandiol, a lot of you are familiar with. It's Zemia. You see it in a lot of products. It'll be called out in the INCI as propandiol, and it's called out as a brand is Zemia. And it is a plant-derived replacement for propylene glycol, which is petrochemically derived. And it's a great material. I mean, it gives a chemist a lot of flexibility. That said, we're trying to get away from the petrochemicals. So I think looking at some of those materials is very interesting, especially if you can get them plant-derived, but they are derived from GMOs. So, you know, you have to be prepared to defend yourself. I wrote a blog that basically says to a lot of chemists, you're committing the sin of omission, because you're giving people these materials and telling them they're plant derived, but you're not telling them that they involve a genetic biosynthesis technology. So I think the cosmetic industry needs to be a little more honest on all levels. And God, there was another one I was thinking of. The propandiol, to go back to that, it's kind of a problem. It's a big problem because, number one, it's made from GMO corn using GMM technology. So, you know, you're kind of getting it from both sides there. And they say that if they ever had enough orders, they could make it from an organic or non-GMO corn base, but they would probably have to make it in another country. A lot of countries don't allow GMOs. We are one of the few that seems to be so inclined. Anyway, anybody have questions? Come on, you guys. And this will be on YouTube. We'll put this up on the YouTube channel, on the OO YouTube channel, because right now we're just going to put all the NOHBA stuff on YouTube, I think, on the OO organic channel until we split them out.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
So a lot of times the definition is broken down, I've observed, between non-GMO and then GMO-free.
Yeah.
So would this, technically, when they're referring to GMO-free, that would fall in the category of GMM?
Not necessarily. Many products from GMOs are GMO-free. What that refers to is what you can test for. So genetic engineering is done using DNA or RNA that comes from protein. So you test for the protein strands when you're looking at these molecules to find out whether or not they are genetically modified. If the process by which you made the material destroys the protein, then it's going to test as GMO-free. You won't see it. You won't be able to perceive it in any of the tests because it's been denatured, basically. Right? Did I get that right, Aubri?
Yeah, GMO-free is really about like the residues in the final product, but it doesn't say anything about how it was produced.
Exactly. So yeah, derivative. What was it derived from? You have to ask them if the feedstock was GMO-free or non-GMO.
Okay. So by definition, the propanediol or the Zemia, by definition, would you say it is accurate to call that not a non-GMO ingredient, or do you feel like that is?
No, it's made from genetically modified corn.
Okay.
I was at a meeting when that material was announced, and the president of the company was there. And I remember talking because my family's from Tennessee, and he was from very close to where my father was born and raised. So we had this nice chat, and I said, in a public meeting, is this from genetically modified corn? And he said, yes, because it's this huge plant where they make cornstarch, and then they have the byproduct of the cornstarch, and then the byproduct of the cornstarch is what's then fed into this genetically modified yeast. So it's GMM for the yeast side and GMO for the feedstock side, right? Okay. So it is GMO free, because if you test it, you will not find any genetic material or protein in the finished product.
Okay, so then the question that we are struggling with is, are there the same health implications or concerns in that ingredient that there would be if it was made with non-GMO derived corn?
I think what you're referring to, it takes us to the next whole stage about why someone would participate in the clean, green beauty industry. I'm here because of my environmental commitment. Mm-hmm. So the problem with GMOs, where Aubri referred, for example, to the potential for carcinogenicity from the glyphosate exposures, which seems to be pretty well borne out. There's more and more research indicating that. More importantly, quite honestly, nothing's more important than cancer, but on a much larger scale, I had a long conversation with a guy who has a PhD in plant, I can't even remember. Crazy guy, crazy PhD from all over. Was brilliant. And I said, so explain to me why everybody is defending glyphosate, because when you put glyphosate in the soil, it has a very short half-life. They're saying, and it's true, you can see the data, it doesn't last long, it disappears. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that it kills the natural microbial activity in soil for all of the areas where it's being used. And the way they use this is you plant the seeds, and it's an herbicide. So it's used to kill all the weeds so that you don't, on one hand, they can say, oh, we don't have to till, so we're doing no-till agriculture, and that's really good environmentally. But they're killing all the weeds. And when you kill the weeds, you kill all the food for the microorganisms that normally exist in the soil. So the soil is becoming essentially sterile. And you need the microorganisms in soil to break down the other nutrients for plants. So it's a holistic system. And they have interrupted the system by destroying that nutrient delivery system in soil by using glyphosate, where it may disappear pretty quickly. It does kill everything in its path that is not the plant it's intended for. So they have married the Roundup with the soy, for example. The other problem, the other health problem in the exposure in terms of cancer risks is that it's also used to ripen things. So if you have a wheat field and not all the wheat is ready for harvesting at the same time, they'll spray it with glyphosate, which is an herbicide. It kills plants, right? So it basically stops the growth pattern of the wheat, and it all becomes ready to harvest at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so there is, obviously, I'm getting way deep in the weeds here. It's a much more complicated issue than you might realize, because it has to do with major agricultural production in the United States. Soy and corn and wheat are the 3 largest crops in the US. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's a direct threat from propandiol. No, I probably not. It's a pretty pure molecule. But the implications of where it comes from and the type of agricultural that supports is environmentally and bad, and therefore a risk to all of us.
Mm-hmm. So, but you did mention that they would be willing to create it in the future from non-GMO corn if they got enough business.
Exactly. They have, I mean, I chat with them, periodically at shows, and yeah, they could do that. And that's how the whole organic industry evolves. It's like you have to build the demand for a type of product. Mm-hmm. And that's why people are now starting to develop safer preservatives and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because our dilemma is, what do we use as an alternative, since petroleum-derived propylene glycol is not an option, and since we need to create products that don't freeze in someone's mailbox in the wintertime and so forth. So it puts us in a dilemma, but we also are in a position where we were under the impression from the beginning that was technically a non-GMO ingredient or a GMO-free ingredient, and now it's that combination of safety doesn't seem to be as much of a concern. Environmental, yes, definitely a concern. Now we need to enlighten our consumers to be more transparent and help educate consumers as to what's going on here. But what does that do to?
Yeah. Some of the other glycols may work. I mean, there's a lot of glycols. You can ask Aubri about that. She works by the hour.
I will say that I definitely think this is a better alternative than a petroleum derived, and you can absolutely say that to your customers, as we are opting for the renewable resource, the renewably derived ingredient, and there's still improvements to be made with it, and we're pushing for that. And you know, you can talk to Samaya, I think Amia is the rep, and say, as soon as you have this new version available, we're interested, and try to push it from that end. There is also a pentylene glycol that has been developed that is non-GMO. So that is a different option as well. It's from Simrise. So we can also chat at some other time if you want to send an email.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to, I'm glad that you brought that example up, Gay, and thank you, Aubri, for this and helping, I guess, make this more transparent and apparent. I do believe that the market speaks, and that's definitely Lyle and Tate, I believe, is the manufacturer.
Yeah, they are.
The distributor, but by all means speak to them, we have been, and just show them that there's a market need and be asking for that information. And as with most things, I think that the EU is really good to look at for your frame, for the documents to ask for, hey, what is your containment policy? You know, what's your safety studies, things like that. It's hard when you're little to get that information sometimes, but
they provide them.
Yeah.
I actually have quite a few of them from producers in Europe. It's just a document they send out with their normal regulatory stuff. It just depends on which product you're talking about.
Yeah, but it often does take asking.
Yeah, you have to ask.
You've got to ask manufacturing flow diagrams, feedstocks,
right.
Knowing the questions to ask, not just final product, because they'll happily give you a statement saying GMO free. As you said, in the final product, it doesn't mean that they're not somewhere in the chain of manufacture. I've got a wider question. So for indications of when to ask these questions, you mentioned yeast products and sugar products. The sugar products are often petrochemical alternatives. Is it a pretty, for the non-chemist, is it a pretty good idea that if there's something, you know, out of the ordinary made with a yeast, like a fragrance or something else, that there's probably green chemistry and genetically modified microbes or something involved? And the same thing for a lot of the sugar-based natural products that are usually petrochemical. Is that like a generalization that maybe gives you a hint?
So actually, I haven't really seen any major patterns because there's such a wide range of molecules that yeast can produce. So it does kind of have to be a question up front. Like you said, the sugar-derived, anything sugar-derived could mean that a yeast is being fed sugar. So that's like the clue that I would look out for. But as far as the final products, it's a full range from water soluble to oil soluble. There's a startup right now working on palm oil from GMOs, which is really interesting. So it kind of has to be one of those upfront questions. Is this produced from biotechnology is maybe how I would phrase it. And they should be able to tell you that.
Great.
Yeah, I think this is where the whole issue of blacklists come in. When you start calling out specific chemicals, you limit yourself. But if you make a policy, if you will, that states technologies that you don't want or derivations, you know, that you want to stay away from petrochemicals as much as possible. Invariably, there's going to be a few molecules of petrochemicals here and there, but you know, like hydrogen, we can't get it any other way right now commercially, or sulfur, we can't get it any other way. But having a policy that basically says what technologies and synthesis methods are acceptable, I've actually designed these for people. We do that for brands. And we'll probably talk about that a little more extensively later in the year on another webinar. Does that answer your question, Dylan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I have another question if you have a second. What do you say to people, or do you understand those that maybe have some fear-mongering surrounding GMM use in terms of automatically placing it in the same category as GMO products or ingredients?
Yeah, I personally, I think, so both Gay and I really come from the environmental background, and to this point, it can drastically reduce land use and resource use, and it is like a really interesting option for sustainable technologies in the future. So that's kind of what I typically hold on to as why I think this will be one way that we produce ingredients in the future. So I think that it's important, Gay mentioned this too, to get ahead of the game, because if you don't say anything about this and then all of a sudden someone calls you out for having GMOs, it's going to be really hard to backtrack and then draw the distinction, versus upfront coming forward and saying this is a technology that we're interested in because it helps reduce land use and saves that land for agriculture. That I think is the way to go, and kind of getting in front of the PR.
Great, thank you. That's helpful to hear. I agree.
Okie doke. Well, if that's it, you guys, we thank you. Keep an eye out. We'll get another newsletter out to you pretty soon. I think on the one that announced, the NOHBA newsletter is what we use to tell you ahead about these webinars. And then Erica does a beautiful job on Instagram, making sure that they're also communicated that way. So make sure you follow NOHBA on Instagram, and I think it's just at NOHBA, NOHBA. And if you haven't been getting newsletters from us and your members, let me know, and we'll make sure you're on the list.